turned into the ice age. Oceans were spilling over. Radioactive bodies remained underground. Spirits floated in the gravitational field of a cooling planet. The voices don't deceive me. They know this little history. Scavengers. The blue flames scorch the old and new law. The island of deadly rays turned into a bikini. Fear became the center of your thinking. You have the right to choose but one single possibility. The murder of the innocent. Murder of the innocent. Murder.
It wasn't so long ago that we began to see their illness as any other disease. But we are still trying to find the reason for the breakdown of balance in their thinking and imagination.
Let us give away our fortunes. The hour of judgment cannot be bought. Let us free ourselves from the chains of want, and life will become a happy game. So speaks the law of nature.
What is it that disturbs the psychotic's relation to the world of normal people? Why do they escape into the distortions of their imaginations and create a unique world of their own? The answers to these questions are still merely hypotheses. Human beings have been adjusting to the living conditions of this planet for many thousands of years. But in the last 50, they have been exposed to such drastic changes, it is nearly impossible to adjust to them psychologically. We are forgetting that the human being isn't merely a biological organism, but is also a social creature full of contradictions and inconsistencies, not only in relation to other people, but also to himself. Conflicts are emerging. Conflicts between reason and emotion, between needs of the individual and those of society. Society is developing its own diseases. Neuroses and psychoses are diseases as dangerous as those of the heart and arteries. We still know very little about the human creature. So far, science hasn't found a satisfactory explanation to the incredibly complicated functioning of the mental processes.
Who hears the peculiar system of earthly life? Why don't we multiply by radiation or the parallel flow of cosmic dust? Scavengers. Why are there women? Why do we use children as an excuse? And what about God? Naive fools, I'm listening.
Certain mental disorders can be evoked artificially. Hallucinogens such as mescaline, psilocybin, and hashish were used by man in his ancient rituals. When pharmacology developed newer, more effective drugs capable of evoking live models of altered biological and psychological processes, it may have produced a way to unravel the mystery of disturbances of the human psyche. The most effective of the substances capable of evoking states similar to certain mental disorders is lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Only a small dosage, measured in micrograms, is sufficient. Soon, time and space assume new dimensions, and perception acquires a more intense quality. The course of a session varies according to the individual. There may be periods of unfounded laughter, feelings of depersonalization, anxiety, or an unusual rush of thoughts. The first experiments were made by doctors, who tested the drug on themselves.
I'm beginning to feel strange. I'm sitting here, but yet I'm not here. It's peculiar. A man might want something, but yet he can't. It's as if each hand belonged to a different body. Now everything is beginning to change. I can see the veins in my hand, and they're changing into a peculiar structure of a leaf. Its shape and size is coming closer and again receding.
The effect of hallucinogens is most interesting from the experimental point of view. Under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs, memories suppressed deep in the unconscious begin to emerge. Seemingly unimportant everyday things assume new significance. Hallucinogens, for the first time, provided doctors with the means of penetrating and experiencing the world of the psychotic, enabling them to find a better approach to the treatment of the mentally ill and to directly influence methods of psychotherapy.
Have you ever seen anything like it?
Hardly. Never.
Although during the session the capacity for orderly thinking is substantially lowered, everyone is aware of the source of his abnormal state and can maintain contact with his surroundings.
Try to close your eyes.
Now I feel as though a foreign object was slowly passing through my body. Yet I feel no pain, but it's unpleasant.
Let's take a walk.
Now it's something completely different again.
What do you see that's so interesting?
It's difficult to describe. I see a strange carriage and women, their faces shrouded with veils. It reminds me of an oriental garden.
Hallucinogens enable us to take a deep look into the human psyche without risking serious consequences. As a rule, after a few hours, their effect disappears.
Who does not know this strange culture, a system of rationing oxygen and false gold. I hear the pleasant hum of death machines, the screams of humanity against mass murmurs, scavengers, serpents with disgustingly large brains. The end of the world will be blue anyway.
Hallucinogenic drugs aren't used exclusively in experimental research. They are also used in the cure of neuroses. When combined with psychotherapy, they significantly shorten the length of treatment. During the session, processes occur which affect a deep reversal in the psyche. Consciousness undergoes peculiar changes. Suppressed conflicts and traumatic experiences emerge in symbolic forms. This happens particularly to patients who have failed to respond to traditional methods of treatment.
Try to relax.
For God's sakes, put an end to it. It's just too awful. I don't want it
Relax.
anymore.
Try to go with it.
Let me go.
Try not to fight it.
The trip into one's unconscious can be accompanied by unpleasant feelings and experiences. This patient certainly didn't know her session would turn out to be so painful. Still, it helped to uncover an important motivating factor of her neuroses. Her paintings, done after the session, indicated that her disorder wasn't merely the result of a traumatic auto accident. This symbolic expression points to a rivalry between her and her invalid brother. As a child, she was jealous of him for receiving more affection from her mother. Furthermore, she was punished when she refused to push him around in his wheelchair. All this emerged in further sessions when the teeth of the scoop gradually changed into the extended, punishing hand of her mother.
In vain we try to burrow our way back to our primal essence. In vain we scrub our souls with a toothbrush. Naive fools. How well I know the little philosophy behind both. Orgasms in hypodermic needles cannot replace love. I'm listening. Why do you devour little children when you know it shouldn't be done? Why? I hear your well voices. I'm listening. It will be all burned anyway by cold blue flame.
Paintings created under the influence of psychoactivating drugs are actually coded messages which help the doctor penetrate the patient's unconscious and quickly uncover the real reason behind the disturbances. Experiments with creative people are usually very interesting. This example shows us the progression of an artist's view of a color photograph. The series of pictures was painted the day after his session. Although hallucinogens frequently evoke subjective feelings of creativity, this potential in itself cannot offer a solution to a deep psychological problem. This can be achieved only when combined with psychotherapy. Hallucinogens haven't escaped the fate of other intoxicants. Man has changed his gods many times, but he still seeks refuge in drugs, as he has for thousands of years. Today, as in years past, people create various fetishes and rituals which are meant to help them live through conflicting situations rather than solving them. To borrow another fate for at least a while is too attractive a prospect to resist. We find the influence of hallucinogens in many forms of artistic expression today. However, the greatest response to these drugs has been among the younger generation, revolting against the depersonalized world of an affluent society. In its search for love and peace, it selected strange leaders. The need to escape feelings of futility, fear, and hopelessness with the help of drugs can lead to hell instead of heaven. Nor have hallucinogens escaped the attention of military experts who thought these drugs might provide the ideal weapon. No one would die. Nothing would be destroyed. The result would merely be a temporary helplessness. Saturation spraying, and entire cities would be paralyzed. It was hoped that hallucinogens would bring an end to bloody, murderous wars.
A two-headed child has been born unto us. Apocalypse of humane wars. Air conditioning in a coffin won't help anyone. In the end, every planet commits harakiri. Naive fools. Complain to yourselves, about yourselves. Pay with your conscience for your new Cadillacs, and don't forget to cross yourselves. Complain, scream, and multiply like mad rats. Naive fools. But don't worry. The cosmic laws of creation and destruction will be fulfilled anyway. Quietly, so quietly. Stay in your places. The great flood will happen calmly and systematically.
Where actually is the border between reality and fantasy? Where does the human capacity to create values end, and where begins the feverish need to escape, to find more and better ways to dull the senses? What is causing civilized nations to resort to escapism in their search for solutions? By turning to alcohol, cigarettes, sedatives, and modern-day rituals. Every day, over 1,000 people commit suicide, and another 8,000 attempt to. We all bear witness to a mass crippling of the psyche in the name of progress and civilization. We are all the accusers, and we all stand accused. Cultural and emotional poverty is as devastating to man as hunger. To achieve mental balance, we don't need robots or tranquilizers. We cannot give meaning to life by escaping reality. There is no turning back.
So speaks the first law, because that much has been granted to man, the capacity to enjoy life. Man isn't dying of thirst, but from the lack of love of his fellow human beings. Save a pearl in the ocean, and the whole ocean will be saved. Save a blade of grass, and the whole world will be saved. Save a pearl in the ocean.
Tonight, Verite departs from its usual format of pure film to bring you an in-depth discussion on the subject of LSD, its clinical aspects and potentials. In 1967, when the drug was declared illegal, many doctors who had been experimenting with it under clinical conditions found themselves shut off from further study. Only a handful of doctors across the country have been allowed to continue with their research. Two of these doctors have joined us tonight to discuss their findings. Dr. Sidney Cohen, clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and formerly the director of drug addiction and abuse at the National Institute of Mental Health, and Dr. Stanislav Grof, who from 1960 through 1967 worked at the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and is presently chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. Serving as moderator is Dr. Norman Barr, Los Angeles psychiatrist and former chief psychiatrist for the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
What is your major interest in LSD research at this time?
Well, my major interest is probably the ultimate of the stresses that confronts man, dying. I am interested in the possibility that the few people who have difficulty dying, who have a good deal of intolerable anguish about their forthcoming death, may perhaps alter their attitude about their personal death through a high-dose LSD experience. This is something that fascinates me. I've been interested in it for the past 10 years, and with a few interruptions, I've come back to it now, and I feel that it answers many questions about the nature of dying, and it answers, or partially answers, some of the questions about LSD.
You're using the drug with people who have terminal cancer, is that right?
Yes, these are people who know they're dying, who have an inoperable cancer, and who are usually in a good deal of pain. And it's interesting how one's feelings about one's ultimate obliteration and one's personal pain might be modulated by things that are surprisingly different. A chemical like LSD might do it, but so might a psychotherapeutic interview. So these are the interesting things that I'm looking at now.
What are some of the good results that you have had with your current work?
Well, we find that in about half the people that receive the drug, there's an amelioration of their pain. Their attitude toward their death is much less dismal. They start dealing with some of the problems that have to be solved before they finally pass away. Their family problems they begin to work with, and their families report to us that these people are more composed and can now contemplate their own extinction without the terror that it used to be involved with. Now, this isn't for every dying person, you understand. It's most people die fairly well, surprisingly enough. It's just for those who are terribly anguished about death, so much so that they're not only unhappy and depressed, but they're a misery to the people who have to take care of them. They're miserable all day long unless they're comatose with narcotics. And so this is really a gratifying situation when it's helpful.
What is the reaction of the relatives of a patient who receives LSD in this circumstance?
Well, all sorts of reactions. We, of course, ask the permission of the relatives to give LSD, and sometimes relatives come up with, well, won't that harm my mother's chromosomes or something of this sort, which is a bit ridiculous. On the other hand, they are gratified with this idea that maybe something can be shifted so that their relative can die a more dignified death.
Have you ever considered giving LSD to the relative of a dying patient?
No, I haven't. But I can visualize a situation where this might work, where the relative is so upset that it might make his concept of death more relaxed. It's a good idea. Glad I came.
Stan, what is your major interest in LSD research at the present time?
I've been working in a group of psychiatrists and psychologists at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and we have been exploring systematically the potential of one of the methods how LSD can be used in psychotherapy. Thus far we have tested it in alcoholic patients, in a group of hard drug addicts, in a group of psychoneurotic patients, and at the present time we have an ongoing study which is very similar to the one that Dr. Cohen mentioned, with terminal patients, in particular cancer patients.
Have you found generally good results in each of these different areas that you mentioned?
Well, this psychedelic treatment is a special type of treatment where we use limited amount of sessions and rather high dosages. And for reasons which we don't quite understand, it seems to work better in alcoholics, drug addicts, and terminal patients than in psychoneurotic patients.
You had quite a series of alcoholic patients previously that you reported on. What were the results there?
We found over 50% of what we considered essential rehabilitation.
Over how long a period?
This was at 6 months. Then we had also 12 months and 18 months follow-up when the results oscillated, but it was around 50%.
What is the major difference, Stan, between the work you're doing here in the United States and what you did in Czechoslovakia?
In Czechoslovakia, it was a very different approach. It was another major way of using LSD in psychotherapy. We call it psycholytic, which is more based on the psychoanalytic model. Use lower dosages, medium dosages, but it involves a whole series of sessions, anything between 15 and 80 sessions per patient.
As I understand it, you're limited by United States law to only 3 treatment sessions at the present time. Is that correct?
It's not a limitation by law. There is another group in the Veterans Administration hospital in Topeka where they have the permission to use serial sessions.
What
just,
limitation do you have? Do you have a limitation, or can you use
We have
as
the
many?
permission for a special design which involves 3 sessions for alcoholics and drug addicts, but we have a more open-ended situation in terminal patients. There we have given up to 6 sessions.
What were your findings in Czechoslovakia with the different treatment approach? Were you working
Well,
with
I would
similar
say,
kinds of people?
I saw much more success in, especially in the psychoneurotic patients, than we saw with the psychedelic treatment. It seems that the psychedelic treatment is much more useful, as I mentioned, in, let's say, alcoholics, drug addicts. But in psychoneurotic patients, it seems that you can't somehow shorten the treatment. You have to go through systematic working through of certain problem areas.
By psychoneurotic, you mean the usual depressions and anxiety reactions?
This could be neurotic depressions, it could be phobias, it could be what we call obsessive compulsive neurosis.
Mm-hmm. Have you had much problem either in Czechoslovakia or the United States with patients having flashbacks after their course of treatment has ended?
We have occasionally seen minor recurrences of the symptoms that were LSD-like, if you want. We don't call it flashbacks, we just see it as a continuation of the uncovering process, and our patients are instructed, they are informed so that they know that something like this can happen, and they are instructed how to cope with it. We have never had major problems in this direction.
I have the feeling that flashbacks when LSD is used as a therapy are much less frequent than when LSD is taken on the street. I reported on all the research and treatment going on in human beings 12 years ago, and I canvassed every researcher who was giving LSD to human beings at that time and found that no one mentioned flashbacks then. And it was only when the drug hit the street that we started hearing about the recurrences, which is interesting.
I was very much involved with flashbacks when I served with the United States Navy from 1967 to 69. Probably one of the largest complaints of the LSD abusers were flashbacks, very often from drugs they took prior to even entering the service. And frequently, of course, there was the question of whether they were malingering or not. But you haven't had much experience or observed.
We haven't seen them very
flashbacks.
frequently, but occasionally you can see it even in the psychotherapeutic framework. I think that it has something to do with how thoroughly the material, the unconscious material that is uncovered in the session is worked through. What you see in people who are experimenting on their own, they usually avoid difficult issues. You know, when something unpleasant is coming up, they tend to avoid that particular experience. They try to run away from it. And under these circumstances, they end up in a much more precarious balance that can result in either prolonged reactions or sometimes even these flashbacks.
Do you ever have any difficulty with overdose due to sensitivity to the drug, or with suicides after LSD therapy, which may be related to the drug?
Well, I never have run into an overdose. I've estimated what the lethal dose of LSD might be, and it's about 15,000 micrograms of pure LSD, which is about 100 times more than the average dose. So that I know of no person who has died as a result of an overdose of LSD. Whatever deaths have occurred for other reasons. And suicide is a consideration because people come down from a peak experience like an LSD experience to this miserable old world and are very unhappy about it and might at that point do themselves in, or as Stan said, they may develop insight into some unconscious material that they can't digest, and they might feel very depressed about that. So that suicide is a possibility. Would you agree?
Yes, I ran myself over 2,500 sessions, and I had about 3 suicidal attempts that sort of followed an LSD session, which doesn't necessarily mean that they were causally related, because in psychiatric patients, you know, the suicidal attempts can occur anyway.
Were many of your patients suicidal prior to treatment, who you feel?
Certainly, yeah.
And their suicidal potential went down then as part of the treatment progressed?
Well, it's an interesting issue. You know, what we typically saw that suicidal patients, when they were able to experience a special type of reaction, which we call the ego death, felt tremendous relief from suicidal urges. So that the ego death could somehow replace the previous suicidal wishes and tendencies.
Sid, what's your impressions about the chromosomal damage resulting from LSD?
Well, of course, we were very interested in it because we didn't want to harm anyone. And so I've reviewed this literature and tried to keep abreast of it. There have been literally a couple of hundred studies done now. A number of them have pointed out that chromosomal damage has occurred. Others can't find this using very similar techniques. My own feeling is that when street users are examined, we rarely see a pure LSD user. There's no such thing as a pure acid head. He's an individual who may be involved in a lot of other drugs. He may be injecting them intravenously along with some infectious material, so that I'm not impressed with the alterations of chromosomes of pure LSD. If there is any problem, it may be the way of life of the heavy drug user, the multiple drug user, that may have some influence on the structure of the chromosomes.
Is it correct to say, and Stan, perhaps I'll ask you, is it correct to say then that where LSD is used in research, and therefore the pure form of the drug is used, that the possibilities for chromosomal damage are very low or non-existent? Or how would you put that?
Well, we have conducted such an experiment ourselves when we sent the blood samples before and after high dose and low dose LSD sessions, and this was an experiment with a negative outcome. I would agree with Sid that the experiments done with pure LSD mostly ended with negative results, whereas the positive results came mostly from the so-called acid heads, where all kinds of other factors might have been involved, like viral diseases, like undernourishment, maybe use of some other drugs, or impurities, admixtures in the street samples.
So then, if I understand what you're both agreeing on, is that the pure LSD is not a possible cause of chromosomal damage.
We wouldn't be doing research with LSD if we didn't believe this to be true. I don't believe that LSD, in the manner it's used in research, is teratogenic or mutagenic or can produce effects in the individual which would be harmful to him in later life.
One of the things you mentioned in your book, The Beyond Within, was the potential hazards to therapists who gave LSD in therapy. Would you discuss that now?
Well, we don't see it anymore, I suppose, because so few therapists use LSD in psychotherapy in the United States. But at one time, when LSD seemed to be such a magic potion, as it is, it produces an enormously unusual state, there were therapists who, perhaps because of their own needs, got involved with giving this drug to patients, and with this feeling of mastery that they could produce such a death-rebirth experience. It was a pretty heady medication for the therapist, and sometimes didn't work out too well to the giver rather than to the receiver.
Stan, did you run into that kind of difficulty in Czechoslovakia with the LSD therapists having emotional problems as a result of the work they were doing?
I think the whole scene in Czechoslovakia was much more sober, at least at the time when I was leaving.
Uh-huh.
So we haven't had any incidents of this kind
I'm
that
aware,
I remember.
Excuse me, I'm aware that in Czechoslovakia that, and I believe throughout Europe, that for someone to administer LSD therapeutically, they have to take at least 5 sessions, 5 doses of LSD under supervision themselves. I assume that you also have had LSD personally. Would you describe what were some of the moving experiences for you personally under the drug?
Well, it would be difficult to describe it briefly. I think it was a variety, a whole range of experiences, from very interesting aesthetic experiences, changes of colors, forms, all the world of the perceptual illusions, orgies of vision, through interesting psychodynamic experiences, reliving of various aspects of childhood, to rather profound experiences that were of a mystical or religious nature, very much similar to what you can read about in, let's say, Indian literature or the ancient Egyptian scriptures and so on. The whole realm of the archetypal experiences of the collective unconscious and so on, as Jung talks about it.
Did you have any terrifying experiences when you were personally using the drug?
Yeah, I think that nobody is immune against negative experiences. It was a whole range of experiences from terror, physical pain, to ecstatic experiences.
I'd like to point something out. What we call a bum trip, ordinarily, is for the psychotherapist who uses LSD a very valuable experience, because the bum trip may often be an encounter that the individual is having with material that he has forgotten or rendered unconscious. So the confrontation with this material becomes anxiety-provoking, and he attempts to run from it. Well, if this is used positively, so that the therapist urges the individual and assists him in confronting himself with it, this is a very valuable moment in therapy. And the bum trip, especially in a psycholytic sense, is an important event. You don't go into psychotherapy with LSD to have a good time, to see the pictures and all that sort of thing. No, these are almost trivia. It's the quality of why one becomes panicky, what is the symbolism that's developing, what is happening to the patient that makes the bum trip a very valuable time in the psychotherapeutic process.
Do the patients who are dying, who take LSD, do they also have bum trips, Sid?
Yes, when they get into for example, if they get into miserable family situations, which they themselves have caused, they get terrific upsurges of guilt and shame and regret that there is no time left to make amends. Well, at this moment, they need tremendous support from the therapist. This isn't anything that should be done by the therapist who only wants to spend 45 minutes with a patient. This is an all-day affair. And the individual must be carried through this, reassured, and brought to a reconciliation of these matters. And then the bummer becomes a good trip.
Is there any way to predict, prior to giving the drug to a selected patient, whether or not that person will have a bad reaction to the drug or perhaps a bum trip? Stan, can you...
Well, I think there are certain types of patients where we can, expect difficulties just on the basis of the initial interviews. Basically, persons who are very controlled, very rigid, who find it difficult, as we call it, to let go into the experience.
And they have a higher incidence of having a bad experience.
Usually persons who are fighting the effect of LSD, especially high dose, have very unpleasant negative experiences. At the moment where they are able to let go, to go with the stream of the experience, many of the unpleasant symptoms can disappear.
Do you find any difference in the reactions of men as opposed to the reactions that women have to the drug?
You see, the reactions to LSD cover such a tremendous range anyway. There is such there are such differences between individuals who take it, and also if you give a whole sequence of sessions, each of those sessions will be different. I wouldn't say that there is some major difference between the...
I have an impression, it's only an impression, that women may be more sensitive to LSD than men, but other than that, they have the same gamut of experience that a man would have.
Have you noticed any difference in terms of the age of a person? Do young people versus middle-aged or older people have different quality reactions?
Well, my own personal opinion is that LSD is a drug for a highly mature, stable individual. And another thing that interests me in connection with LSD is the possibility that it may enhance certain creativity activities, creativity of thought or artistic creativity, so that I don't object to the possibility that older people, indeed very old people, might require an exposure to LSD. And what astounds me is that these depleted cancer patients who really look terribly ill can sustain a day-long LSD experience. And it is a stressful day.
I can imagine. It must be very stressful and perhaps exhilarating the day after if they put it together.
If they put it together, it's one can come back into the room and feel the quietude and the relaxation that wasn't there the day before.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any difference that you've noticed either on the East Coast or the West Coast with racial characteristics, people black, brown, or white people, in terms of their reactions to LSD?
Again, I would say the same thing as I said before for the male-female differences. Especially with the high dosages, the session reaches to such profound levels that you're operating on an all-human niveau, where various differences such as race and even religion don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. So
for example, previous educational background doesn't have to influence the way in which the subject in an LSD session experiences the religious experience.
Is psychosocial and cultural sophistication of an individual an influencing factor?
Well, I think it's helpful. I would hope that the person to whom I'm trying to explain the experience or what he might expect would have an understanding and openness to out-of-the-body experiences. If he isn't able to conceptualize that, he may become confused during the LSD state and frightened and sort of disorganize instead of reorganize. And so I think that a certain level of intelligence and a certain level of openness and, as Stan said before, flexibility, a willingness to be changed, these are important variables in the LSD experience.
Sid, what do you think the attitude of the government should be regarding LSD research? Do you feel that it's the present attitude that the government has is what it should be? And if not, how should it be modified?
Well, you said before that LSD is called a dangerous drug. I think it is. I have tremendous respect for this drug. I was amazed when it spilled over into the street and it was being casually taken at parties. I just couldn't believe this was possible, but it all happened. I would think that certain controls are necessary. One of the worst casualties of our present LSD scene is that it has impaired the research that has to be done with this drug. This is a drug that can tell us an enormous amount about mental activity, the nature of thinking, of feeling, of perceiving. All of these things become very clear to the researcher when he's looking at dozens or hundreds of LSD experiences. I think that not only must more therapeutic work be done, supervised, careful, good selection of patients and all the rest, but we also must study the psychology of LSD, and these other states, these transcendental states must be studied.
Let me interrupt you for a moment,
Sure.
Sid. I'd like to ask a question on this line, actually to both of you. And perhaps you can start, since you're on the track, Sid. Assuming that a presidential candidate came to you and asked you to write a position statement that he could use and support in his campaign for the presidency, What would you write down for him to, what would you recommend to him?
Well, I think that I would want this drug to be controlled, but that not so controlled that it constricts reasonable research, because the importance of this drug is too great to hide, and the mere fact that one part of the population is abusing it doesn't mean that we shouldn't exploit the real uses of this agent.
Do you feel then that the government should allow or should take steps to encourage more research?
Yes, I do. I would say that.
Stan, how would you
Yeah, we were
advise
asked
the presidential candidate?
We were asked this question before, not by presidential candidates, but by some other people in prominent positions. And our suggestion was to build a network of government-sponsored facilities where people who want to experiment with psychedelics, who do it anyway, could volunteer, could become subjects in scientific research, could be given LSD under the proper circumstances by trained, experienced professionals, could also get pure LSD, which is very seldom the case in the self-experimentation. So that all these, all this experimentation could be utilized somehow for promoting our understanding of
that sounds similar to the,
substances.
excuse me, to the experience with heroin that was tried in England for a while, where the drug was available to the abuser.
I don't think that's a good comparison. Heroin is a matter of taking 3 or 4 times a day, and as I gather what Stan is saying, an LSD experience is something that might be once in a lifetime. So that I don't think we ought to use that comparison.
But that these clinics would be available primarily to all people, but assuming primarily young people would use them, since they're the ones who are apparently abusing the drug in the largest
What
numbers.
I had in mind was primarily people who need it for, emotional reasons, because they have emotional problems, but also other people, interested people from the population who would like to have that experience.
Thank you, Dr. Stanislav Grof and Dr. Sidney Cohen, for a most enjoyable and informative evening.
We got to get this guy tonight and once and for all. We've been out there now 5 cotton-picking times.
You want me to put a man on that main trail to the left over here?
I'll tell you I want a man in there, and I want flank security out also. I want more fire superiority on this. I want point of aim, point of impact. Let's aim at these targets, let's hit these targets. We want this here VC, and I want him bad. So is the CO, so is everybody else. He's got a carbine, he uses, he knows how to use it, he's been hitting people. Let's get him now. Let's kill this guy.